Welcome to the Vernuccio. Novak Report and the American Political Zone. From New York, this is Frank Vernuccio.
And from West Palm Beach, Florida, this is John Wilson.
Yeah, rub it in, why don't you, John?
Well, I'll tell you this, the weather here has not been as wonderful as it normally is. We've been having these very chilly temperatures in the 60s and the 70s lately.
You're in deep trouble, John. That's all I can tell you. Well, speaking about deep trouble, as we're going to talk about a bit further on the show, Congress, as we're speaking now, is voting on or considering the impeachment of Donald Trump. John, last time I checked, there had to be a reason other than I just don't like you for an impeachment of an American president. What we've seen during this Congress has been impeachment brought about simply over policy differences and, frankly, personality differences as well. You have a great article at usagovpolicy.com today, and I think the second part is tomorrow. Tell us a bit about what you wrote.
Let's begin with the last impeachment, shall we? Which I don't really address in the article, but let's look at that last impeachment. That last impeachment was based on false information, and I don't think there's anybody of any reasonable mind who can say that the information provided to the Congress was anything but false. The whole Russian collusion story has fallen apart, is a fraud, and has been acknowledged by anybody of goodwill as having been a fraud. Now, fast forward to the recent events at the Capitol. Once more, the Congress is considering an impeachment based upon a fraud. The allegation here is that President Trump incited a riot. Words like sedition and insurrection are being tossed around freely. It's not in today's article, it's in the one tomorrow at usagovpolicy.com. But if I might quote the exact words that Donald Trump used when he was addressing the crowd prior to the riot, and I think that's a more accurate word than insurrection, a riot, he said near the end of his speech, "We're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I love Pennsylvania Avenue. And we're going to the Capitol, and we're going to try and give our Republicans, the weak ones, because the strong ones don't need any of our help, we're going to try and give them the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country." Those are the president's exact words toward the end of his speech. He had similar comments more toward the beginning of his speech, where he said, which might be tougher language, but our country has had enough. We will not take it anymore. That's what this is all about. Now it's up to Congress to confront this egregious assault on our democracy. After this, we're going to walk down. I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down to the Capitol. We're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women. You have to show strength. You have to be strong. There is nothing in those words that would lead to the incitement of a riot. There is nothing in those words that is insurrection. He's telling people to cheer the Congress people as they work. He's not telling them, let's stop them, let's go in there and take the wheels of power. So once more, the Congress is considering a fraud for an impeachment.
John, it's been a long, long time since I graduated law school, but I do remember cases involving the First Amendment and how strict a standard there was to restrict that. I mean, we can go back to cases like Brandenburg v. Ohio, which set a standard. We can talk about, the level that you have to pass in order to say that you are inciting a riot. If, for example, I say this government is corrupt and something must be brought about to make a change, that's not insurrection. That's not sedition. If I'm on a street corner carrying an M16 and I say, let's take this government over now, well, that's a little bit different. But the standard of suppressing speech, of calling free speech an incitement to riot or incitement to insurrection is so high, it is obvious. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to be a constitutional scholar to know clearly that what President Trump or even Rudy Giuliani said in no way meets the standard of incitement to riot or incitement for any kind of violent action.
No, as we know, the famous standard is you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater with the intention of causing a panic. To say that we're going to march down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Congress and cheer on our Congress people and senators cannot, by any reasonable mind, be construed as seeking to overthrow or take over the government in any way. And believe me, we're talking about the President of the United States. If the man seriously wanted to take over the government, he certainly has more effective measures for doing so. And so this is once more just another fraud being perpetrated on the American public by the enemies of President Trump. Go ahead.
You know, the collective amnesia of the media is kind of fascinating. Off air, you and I were discussing. How about when Maxine Waters said, if you see a Trump appointee in a restaurant or a gas station, confront them, harass them, that sort of thing. How many instances did we see over the past 4 years where an actor or actress in particular held up a figure of a severed head of Donald Trump and encouraged people to assault him, to kill him? How many times have we heard actors? I think Robert De Niro was another one. I think Johnny Depp was another one who visibly and audibly talked about killing the president of the United States. I believe Depp's comment was, it's been too long since an actor shot a president. Obviously, nothing was done in response to those comments. The left, in fact, cheered it on, as they cheered on the riots by Antifa and Black Lives Matter, including when Antifa or Black Lives Matter took over a police station, took over an entire portion of the city and declared it an independent zone, free of the government of the United States. The insurrection standard, sedition standard, was not used in those extreme cases. And yet, in this instance, it was. And the left is continuously going on this, ignoring all of their past sins over the past 4 years.
We have more examples of that. The governor of California, Gavin Newsom, in June of 2020, protesters, you matter. God bless you. Keep doing it. Your rage is real. That is closer to inciting violence than anything that President Trump said. We have other examples of Maxine Waters. I mean, as you cited before, if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, gas station, you get out, create a crowd, you push back on them, you tell them they're not welcome anymore anywhere. That led to actual violence against Trump administration officials and other Republican officials across the country. At no time have we seen Maxine Waters sanctioned in any way whatsoever. And to add insult to injury, you'll remember that Ilhan Omar of Minnesota made a series of anti-Semitic comments. The Congress couldn't even organize themselves to condemn her anti-Semitic comments. Instead, they watered it down to just a general decrying of anti-Semitism without naming the person responsible for this amendment to be added. So it's become unreasonable at the extreme.
And going back to our original topic, the politicalization of impeachment, what we're seeing is not just the politicalization of impeachment, but the politicalization of the law as a whole. We saw early on in the Trump administration, the Ninth Circuit, when they decided, a bunch of judges there decided that they were going to exercise presidential power. They decided they were going to knock down the president's power to limit immigration or to limit travel to the United States. This is clearly an executive prerogative. And yet several judges of the Ninth Circuit voted to essentially say that they had a power higher than the president's in terms of this policy, which is clearly within the executive branch. I believe Jeff is saying that we have our first guest on board. Welcome, Jared Hendricks. And Jared is coming on. Okay, we're going to have Jared on in just a second. But it's that politicalization of the entire system of justice in the United States. Indeed, you might also say that the refusal of the Supreme Court to take up Texas's and 24 other states' complaint about the way elections were being conducted was a politicalization of the court. They didn't decide on the merits. They simply decided to ignore the reality of what was going on and wouldn't even have a hearing. And I think we have Jared. Welcome, Jared.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Jared, it's great. Before we get into your experience in Washington, you're a political consultant. I wanted to ask you a question. Now that we have seen almost the legitimization of cheating in this 2020 election, we saw the court refuse to intervene in clear-cut cases where governors or secretaries of state decided to ignore their own state's regulations and rules on campaigning, on election. As a political consultant, are you almost forced now in the future to tell your clients, well, the other side is cheating, so you might as well too?
Well, I guess it comes down to a matter of personal ethics. Me, it's just more of a motivation to get more people that follow the Constitution. It's pretty clear, like at the Pennsylvania case, to me, that was a clear-cut matter of law that the state legislature has the authority on the electors, which is funny because that's what, the whole message has been from the media about January 6th, how they say it's so wrong, the legislature has the authority. Well, yet in that case, there was a situation where clearly the legislature had the authority, but the bureaucrats and the state Supreme Court made, I think, the wrong decision. So, we could go a long way if we get some people that would honor their oaths.
Indeed. Wasn't it the Pennsylvania Secretary of State who said that no way will Trump be allowed to win this election?
I'm not sure about that. I don't know. That sounds familiar.
Jared, you were in DC. Tell us exactly what you saw, exactly what you heard. And I think we're having connection.
Well, yeah, I came from, actually, I drove up there because I have family. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, just stop me if it gets bad. Well, so I came up, I drove up from southeastern Virginia. I got family down there, so I was actually already in the state. And, I met up, actually, it's a pretty interesting story. That morning, I helped organize a group of Vietnamese.
Okay, Jeff.
Organize a group of Vietnamese Americans. And, that.
Okay.
Are you guys having connection?
Jared, we're having problems hearing you. I'm going to ask Jeff if we can get a phone connection to you rather than an internet connection, and perhaps we'll have better luck that way.
Impeachment proceedings that are going forward in the Congress right now. I'm heard this is called a snap impeachment. That is, they're not holding any hearings. At least in the last fraud, there were hearings held and witnesses were given an opportunity to testify in secret, as we recall. Witness testimony being taken in secret without the opportunity of cross-examination by Republicans and by President Trump's lawyers. But you will recall that I wrote earlier columns addressing those problems with the procedure that was being conducted, comparing it to the Star Chamber. And that's an article you can find in the archives at usagovpolicy.com, October of 2019. So that's how long we've been dealing with these problems. Now the Congress isn't even holding hearings on these allegations. They're just going right ahead and voting their impeachment, which is the equivalent of an indictment. Snap is a very appropriate term here because snap is the same noise that your neck breaks when you're lynched, which is what's going on right now if we're conducting a snap impeachment. More to the point, what is the reason for this impeachment, knowing that President Trump is leaving office next week on the 20th? why would you go ahead with the impeachment of someone who's not going to be in office?
John, you know,
Obviously-
I had a thought on that, and I believe this impeachment is not, strangely enough, aimed at Donald Trump. I think it's a statement by the Democrats in Congress, for the most part, that if you dare to cross us, we will get you one way or the other. And I think it is an impeachment, again, not aimed at one man, but basically at an entire movement. And I think it's also true of the handful of Republicans that were supporting this as well. It's their attempt to take back the Republican Party from the Trump majority. I think we have Jared back on the phone. Jared, are you there?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Jared, great.
All right,
You were
Jared.
about to tell us your impressions. You were at the events in Washington. Tell us what you saw, what you heard.
Sure. Yeah, and just stop me if you can't hear me. Sorry about the technical issues. So yeah, we by my view, I try to separate that there's kind of two things happening here. Obviously, there's the incident at the Capitol, which the media has just been hyper focusing on. And I try to separate, we had a great rally. We had a great speech by the president. We had a peaceful march. And that was all just a phenomenal event. And what happened from the Capitol is a whole different thing, in my opinion. But the thing that struck me was just the diversity of the crowd. I mentioned a minute ago, I don't know if you could hear me if I was breaking up, but that morning I helped organize and load up. We had 10 buses that left the Vietnamese Community Center in Northern Virginia. And I just think it was fantastic just to see such a wide cross section of Americans that are, part of this Trump movement. And especially, the Vietnamese, I mean, understand most of those folks came from communism. They literally fled communism during the war. And a lot of them have very strong disposition against Biden, because Biden was one of only 2 senators who voted to not allow Vietnamese refugees into the country during the war. And so anyway, all that's just to say that people, I think, recognize that there is a dramatic movement in this country towards this democratic socialism, and they've had enough of it. So to me, it was just a great gathering of patriots. It was positive. I met just the nicest people you ever meet from all over the country. And as the president said, let's peacefully and patriotically march towards the Capitol. And that's what we did. And it's unfortunate that things got a little wild at the Capitol, but I just want to make that distinction that this was hundreds of thousands of people. It's a peaceful event. And it was just great patriots coming together.
Jared, it's John Wilson. Let me ask you this. You've probably heard the allegations that some of the actions that occurred at the Capitol were the result of infiltration by Antifa forces. If you can comment on that, and if you have any information regarding those allegations, we'd certainly like to hear it.
Well, so I didn't witness, I wasn't inside the Capitol. I didn't witness those things firsthand. The barricades that were broken down at the Capitol, I mean, all of that was already well past. That had already occurred before I got to that area, or before, most of the hundreds of thousands of people got to that area. So I just want to say that I didn't witness anything firsthand. Most of what I know came from conversations with people and whatnot. And so what I think happened is that I think it was a mixture. I think there were some Trump supporters that were unfortunately doing things they should. I don't like to even call them Trump supporters. I mean, they might have just been frustrated people who were not Antifa. But certainly there were Antifa people. I mean, you could see them, walking around. There were some leftist protesters here and there. I mean, I saw Black Panther groups marching through the streets. And I'm not saying that they were a part of that. I'm just saying that there were multiple different groups there. So undoubtedly there were Antifa that were mixed in. As far as what percentage was this or that, I don't really know. But I do think that there were people on all sides that were unfortunately engaging in vandalism.
I'll tell you why I think this is an important point. Too many people on the left are believing lies they're told on such a consistent basis that we on the right, I think, can have an obligation to believe the truth. And we've heard some stories on the right that this was not a Trump incident, that these were all Antifa. And so rather than believe lies, I'm a strong believer, as I know you are as well, in believing what the truth is. So that's the purpose of my question there. If there is very little evidence of Antifa being participants, I think our listeners want to know that, the same as they want to know any of the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also important to distinguish, and this is what makes it difficult, because it's important to distinguish between some of the folks that were obviously breaking windows, stealing things, engaging in criminal activity, versus the ones who just kind of went into the Capitol. And of course, then I guess you could say, well, that's trespassing. That's still a problem. But my point is that there were a lot of people that I think just kind of went in after things were broken and after things were opened up. And I would say that in some cases, it might have been even kind of innocent. I mean, I saw pictures and even heard from people of some older folks who were walking around. You probably saw some of the pictures where there were roped off sections, and they're just kind of in an orderly manner walking through the Capitol building. And they, honestly, some of them probably just thought it was open. And you got to remember, probably most of the crowd that was there that day had never even been to DC before. I mean, probably a lot of them just assumed you could go to the Capitol building and talk to your representatives. I mean, it might sound silly, but it's probably true. And so I don't think that everybody was engaging in the same level of, I guess, chaos, if you want to use that term. And so, I think it was a mixture of people, to be honest. That's just kind of what my gut tells me. And I can tell you other things. Like, for one instance, I talked to a guy who was a Trump supporter. I mean, he was decked out with Trump stuff. I talked to him when we were there on the ground right outside the Capitol, and he said that when he was up there, probably where he shouldn't have been, but he was up there on the balcony area, and there was some guy that was taking, I don't know what he had, like a 2x4 or something, and he was trying to break the windows, and he was trying to stop him. So there was a lot of that going on. There were people that were getting out of hand, and there were other people that were trying to stop them. And that's what's really hard to sort through. I mean, from a law enforcement perspective, I mean, they've got a lot to investigate to figure out who was really doing what. I think there's a difference between trespassing, standing on the balcony, versus breaking windows.
And let me ask you this question. You said you heard the president's speech. Was there anything in what you heard that would make you want to go to the Capitol and tear the place down or take over the government? And the people that were around you, the same reaction? What were their reactions to President Trump's speech?
For me, I would say absolutely not. I mean, certainly people are upset, and when people get upset, sometimes a very, very minute fraction will do some things that maybe they shouldn't do. But I mean, the answer is no, absolutely not. I don't think there's anything that Trump intended or directly said that was designed to incite any kind of rioting. I think that's an absolutely ridiculous claim. And if that's the foundation of their impeachment, I think it's completely null and void. But on the flip side, I do think that it's important that if we're serious, for everybody grandstanding and talking about how terrible this incident was, and obviously it was, people died. But for everybody saying that in the media, I think they need to be serious and ask themselves, well, why are people frustrated? I mean, if you want to solve the problem, you have to ask that question. We have 4 years of the way this president's been treated. In the last year, people have lost their businesses, their jobs because of the government shutdowns. People are frustrated. And so I see it as, is it really that surprising that people lash out like this? Violence is almost inevitable when you treat people this way. And again, I'm not excusing it. I'm not saying that it's okay to smash windows by any means. I'm just saying that it's not that surprising that it happened. And with what they're doing now with this big tech censorship cracking down, I think it's just going to make things worse, because when you censor people and you remove the nonviolent options they have to express themselves, well, what's left? It's the violent options. So unfortunately, they're fueling this fire when they really could be doing more to try to unify the country.
Let me be very specific. While you were there, was there any group leader? Was there any speaker? Was there any organizational emphasis or any organizational encouragement of violence at all?
None that I saw.
The crowd that you were with, did any of them seem to have had a predisposition of coming to Washington with the idea of committing violence?
Well, that's a little harder question to answer because I don't know what's in people's minds, obviously. There were people there that seemed very frustrated and they believed the election was stolen. And so, I mean, anyone who believes that is going to be pretty irritated on the situation. But as far as like seeing some, organized movement of thousands of people marching down Pennsylvania Avenue to cause a ruckus, I didn't see that. And in fact, the other point, and this is what I've heard from reports, I didn't witness it, that the people that broke down the barricades and started with the vandalism had arrived, I think, maybe even significantly earlier than most of the people who left Trump's speech. Remember, there were hundreds of thousands of people there. So by the time most of us got to the Capitol area, most of that, the violent altercations had already occurred or were at least in progress. And most of us didn't have cell signals. I mean, we were slowly getting in news that there was someone shot inside the Capitol, and we're just standing outside. We didn't have any clue that stuff was going on inside.
Jared, it's a fascinating discussion, and it was a frightening experience. Thanks so much for being on the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
John, it is reminiscent, I think, of events that occurred in the 1930s. You recall the historical incident called the Reichstag fire, where Nazis set fire to the Reichstag, which was Germany's version of the Capitol building. And despite the fact that they did it, they used it as a pretext to go after their political opponents. And the calls for censorship that came with lightning speed after this event occurred, and it seemed to occur in an almost organized manner between the left-wing politicians, their supporters on the social media, and their reporters on the conventional media. It followed such a precise pattern that it does give rise to speculation that there is some element of pre-planning in all of this.
Well, we were talking before about the purposes of conducting an impeachment against President Trump when he only has less than 2 weeks in office. And just before our guest came on, I was going to reference to you that there is besides the purpose that you discussed, there is a purpose that's directed against President Trump directly. And that purpose is an attempt to prevent him from running for re-election in 2024. There is a contingent of the left that does believe that if they impeach the president, that they're able to go forward with a Senate trial, whether he's president or not, with the idea that he would be ineligible then to take office again. That's been debunked by legal expert Alan Dershowitz, who notes that the language in the Constitution, and I note this in my article, specifically states that the power of the Senate is to remove the president, not to remove the former president, not to prevent the president from running for re-election, just to remove the president. So this is a hope and a prayer by the Democrats who want to prevent a strong opposition from Donald Trump in the 2024 election. It's doomed to failure. And even the more moderate elements of the Democratic Party are now being heard saying, what's the rush? We can handle this at a later date, which truly means let's not address this at all. Let's just let our tempers calm down and go about our real business. I might notice, by the way, this is terrible for the incoming president, Joe Biden. It shows the utter lack of control he has over his own party, and particularly over the more extreme elements of his own party, that he has no ability to say to the Democrats in Congress, listen, let's work on my agenda and worry about this guy, if at all, when the time comes. That
Well, doesn't that also feed into the belief by many that Joe Biden was always just a figurehead for the hard left, a figurehead for perhaps what some call the deep state, that he's an older guy. His dream of being president has been fulfilled. And that we talk about the start of the Biden era, but for Joe Biden, it seems as though it stops on inauguration day. He's achieved what he wants to achieve. He finally made it to the White House on his third try, and he'll sit back and let the left basically run their agenda.
he's the William Henry Harrison of our times. I mean, not to wish him any bad luck. Obviously, what I'm referring to is somebody who's only going to be president for a short time, while those around him actually take the power. Whether he remains a figurehead over the next 4 years, or whether what I suspect happens is that the Hunter Biden investigation suddenly ramps up and he's removed from office for either that or just for a mental incompetency, one or the other. The real intention all along has been to place someone in the office of the White House who's even more amenable to the extremist elements of the Democratic Party and their agenda. And so there won't really be any Biden legacy other than as a footnote for somebody who just didn't fulfill his term.
And, we do have a bit of a historical precedent for that sort of thing occurring. Woodrow Wilson, I believe, had a stroke while he was in office, was completely incapacitated, and those around him, actually his wife primarily, actually ran the government. In essence, there was no orderly process of government. It was those folks on the inside that really ran it. Indeed, Wilson's vice president wasn't even part of that loop. It was a group of basically of insiders who did it all. Now, I think in this case, you have Kamala Harris, who is probably the person the left really wants in there. But I do think that there is a real danger of that occurring again.
Let's face it, Kamala Harris is another box that the left wanted to check. We now have a woman of color in this position. Check that box. That I have no doubt, and I'll go on the record now as predicting that were she to take over as president, she's going to pick someone like Pete Buttigieg as her vice president. Why? Not because he's qualified in any way, but because he fulfills another box that can be checked off.
And interestingly enough, both in the case of Pete Buttigieg and Kamala Harris, both were rejected by the majority of Democrats. They're both considered too far to the left or too inappropriate for the position. And so in some ways, this was not only a takeover by the left of the US government, it was a takeover by the left of the Democrat Party as well.
The left has been gaining power and strength in the Democratic Party ever since the 1960s. And if we watch the history of the left's involvement with the Democratic Party, we can see that clearly, that they went from being outliers to being centers of power within the Democratic organization. I've written a series of columns now at usagovpolicy.com where I am pointing out the communist influence on the left, the hardcore communist ideology that is being displayed in all the actions of leftists.
Yep.
And I'm old enough to remember when, you probably remember this too, you'd hear people say, it's all a commie plot. And of course, we used to laugh at people who said that. Today, I'm not laughing anymore. Today, more and more, as I reveal the communist influences that are affecting the teachers' unions, which was an article that I wrote, that you see infecting the ideology of an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, we just see more and more of this communist ideology being played out every day.
You go back to the era you were talking about. Isn't it remarkable that there was one US senator who was talking about communist under every bed? And of course, he has been mocked and vilified for over half a century. And yet Hollywood has vilified and mocked everyone on the other side. The whole, you're not going to work in this town again unless you vote for the hard left. and yet nothing is done. There have been poems, there have been plays, there have been movies written about those days, and yet now a half century of ostracization by the left, of conservatives not being able to be students on campuses, professors who are on the right not being hired, or just even in the middle not being hired on college campuses, and yet we hear nothing about that.
Yeah, let's talk now about the role that big tech is playing in this right now. The website Parler. We had the chairman, the owner of Parler on the show before. I remember.
Correct.
I was co-host then, and we interviewed him. Not a conservative man, but not a conservative ideologue. And his entire intention of the Parler site was to have free discussions, not to foster any revolutions, not to be a conservative alternative to Twitter, just to be a free source of conversation. Look what's happened to him now, just because he gave the means for conservatives to converse with one another.
John, let's go to our next guest. Scott Garliss is the editor of Stansberry News Wire and the Stansberry News Wire Premium. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Scott, your perspective, you talked a bit about Americans should be, quote, paying public officials like California Gavin Newsom and New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, and of course the governor of the state of New York, Governor Andrew Cuomo. What do you mean by that?
Wait, hang on a second. I couldn't hear that last part. You said what?
You mentioned that the public should be paying people like Gavin Newsom of California, Mayor Bill de Blasio, and New York City and New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo to manage the current crisis. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, in terms of to managing the current crisis, I mean, they should be doing what they think is best for their constituents and for economic growth in their areas.
Do you find that I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
Could you flesh that out a little bit? I'm not sure that I understand what you mean by that. What would they do in that regard?
Well, I think they need to do what's going to be best for their states in the long term. They need to think about what's going to keep people the most healthy and what's going to allow businesses to operate at their maximum capacity without causing a problem in terms of infection and sickness.
It's interesting because, I mean, here in New York State, Governor Cuomo, after making massive errors in the COVID crisis, which directly resulted in the deaths of over 6,000 seniors, then decided to shut down the state, has taken a look at his budget and decided that that will lead to a financial catastrophe. So do you feel that the actions of a Governor Cuomo have been helpful to New York State, or they have been harmful to New York State?
Well, it's a tough thing to say, simply because that's not a spot I think anybody is envious of. But I think one of the things that we need to make sure we're doing also as a country and on a state-to-state basis is that American businesses and entrepreneurs are really great at overcoming obstacles and figuring things out and coming up with solutions. And I think American businesses and entrepreneurs need to be allowed within the scope of possibilities to be able to do those things. Otherwise, we're not going to find solutions that create the best situation for everybody. So, I mean, just clamping down, I don't know that that's necessarily the right answer. I don't know that free reign, but there's a middle ground somewhere in between that I don't feel like we're necessarily figuring out as a country. And I think that's what we need to be doing more of, and talking to businesses and figuring out what's working and not working, other than saying, I've decided this is the right thing for you to do, so you're going to do it.
So let's talk about the difference between how New York has handled the COVID crisis and how a state like Florida has handled the COVID crisis. I mean, we've seen articles recently, and I'm in Florida right now, in fact, where Florida has maintained the more open economy. Restaurants are open, not at full capacity, but you're able to dine both indoor and outdoor. Many of the attractions are open that people can attend. Beaches are open. In New York, restaurants were precipitously shut down, and other measures were taken. Yet New York has suffered not only more deaths, but has suffered just as many COVID cases, if not more, than a more open state like Florida. So what's the solution there? Following Florida's model, or following New York's model, or if something in between? What do you feel should be done?
Yes, well, I think it's something in between. And the reason I say this is you're looking at sort of very, very disparate weather patterns that take place in Florida versus New York, right? Like, so the problem with wintertime is more of us have to go indoors when it gets colder. And the problem with more of us going indoors is that we're breathing the same air. And so when we're breathing the same air inside, that's where there's more of a problem with virus spread. But when we're breathing that same air outside, where it's moving around, and this is why we saw restaurants were able to do very well in the summer months, in the spring months, and even the fall, because the temperatures were better outside. Now, I think restaurants should be allowed to figure out outside, you know, if they can build sort of, if they're in colder places like New York, if they can put up heat lamps and, you know, an overhead structure to keep off rain or snow. If people want to sit out in the cold and talk to one another and have a glass of wine or something to eat, I don't see why that shouldn't be allowed. That's the diner's option to be in that cold. But I can see why being more restrictive indoors is a problem. Now, I live just north of Baltimore City in Baltimore County, Maryland. And Baltimore County has been restricted. They've cut back on capacity inside, but they haven't shut it down. And restaurants are doing all right. You know, we have like a 7% infection rate right now. It's going back up. But Baltimore City has completely shut it down. And the county is prospering more because the county and the Maryland governor, the county executives and the Maryland governor are being, you know, much more, they're working with businesses much more, is what I'm looking to say. And that's allowing people to do more in those areas.
Well, if you look at New York City, for example, only 1.4% of reported positive cases can in any way, shape, manner, or form be traced back to restaurants. If that's the case, isn't it a kind of irrational decision by state executives or city executives to close down restaurants when in fact practically next to nothing, but 1.4% can be traced to restaurants? Also, is it realistic to believe that you can shut down a private business for months upon months and then expect them to be able to open back up? Businesses in many cases run by a month-to-month basis. They will be bankrupt within a reasonable amount of time. Are we not playing with permanently destroying a major section of our economy if we do this?
Yes, that is definitely a problem. Okay, so back to the restaurant question first, and you were saying that the traceability. Cuomo has said, I've listened to a number of his press conferences, that the bulk of the infections that New York is seeing is because of people having house parties. I think he said in a couple
Correct.
Press conferences ago, it was like 70% of all infections are because of the house parties. And again, I think trying to figure out with these restaurants what's appropriate spacing or allowing them to have outdoor dining in the cold versus inside a lot. But yes, if you completely clamp down on businesses and shut them down, you know, you're correct. They're going to be people that go out of business permanently. You know, I know that the restaurant business is great business, but I don't believe the margins are incredible, and that's why you see these large restaurant groups that the ones that do well are the ones that own a bunch of restaurants. But you know, it's unfortunately, it's sort of like the financial crisis when these types of things happen. There's financial calamity. There were businesses that went under, and there were other things that grew up in their place afterward. That when they came back with less debt, and they were they were more vibrant businesses. Now, I think if you're going to place the restrictions you're talking about, I think, you have to follow. If you're going to tell people they can't do business, then you need to step in and support them at the same time too. And you need to make sure you are offering some sort of aid so that you do have these businesses there that can come back. The construction business in Maryland, I don't know what it looks like in New York, but a lot of the numbers I've seen nationally, construction business is one that has done very well throughout this. With interest rates going lower, we've seen refis and housing numbers are the highest levels they've been since like 2003, and housing supply is at the lowest level it's been since 1968. And that's a business where people work in very close quarters, putting houses together, and they don't seem to be having problems.
Mhm.
Now we're seeing an effect on the market as a result of the introduction of the vaccine. Won't the vaccine's introduction into the population lead to some more of these increased economic conditions you're talking about?
Yeah. So when you're looking at the markets, what you need to think about it is think like a money manager. And where the money managers are trying to look at this right now, they're thinking about the vaccine, and they're thinking about, hey, things are slow now, and the Fed is really stimulative in terms of its monetary policy, and now Congress is the fiscal policy they're introducing is very stimulative. And you have an administration coming to the White House that's talking about doing even more. There's speculation that Biden tomorrow, when he introduces his new plan, it's going to be worth $3 to $4 trillion between coronavirus aid and an infrastructure bill. So what money managers are trying to think about is, hey, in 8 to 10 months, with the vaccine introduction and more widespread inoculation, plus all this stimulus money that's coming in the door, the economy come late spring, early summer could be in a really good spot. So where people are having a hard time sometimes, I think looking at this is they're saying, why does it seem like Wall Street is dislocated with Main Street? It's not that Wall Street is thinking differently than Main Street. It's just Wall Street's thinking, hey, if the economy is going to be in this great spot in 8 to 10 months, we need to start buying stuff now, because if you wait until that great economic boom shows up, it's going to be too late to buy those things you want to purchase. And I think they're also looking at it too, like another economic data point I would point out to you, manufacturing and industrial production numbers, they're really good as well. So the way they're looking at manufacturing, industrial production, construction, which is like 15 to 18% of economic output. There are a lot of areas that are doing well. It's just the service-related industries like hotels, restaurants, airlines, cruises. Those are businesses that are not doing well at the moment, but they will come back. It's just going to take more time.
We talk about putting all this money into the economy, spending several $1 trillion, as though we can just use monopoly money. I hearken back to the 1920s. There was a famous photo, used to be in a lot of history books, of a guy in Germany who, in the hyperinflation of the 1920s in Germany, took a wheelbarrow full of marks to the grocery store to buy his family some food to eat. And the cashier looked at the wheelbarrow full of money and said, nah, keep the money, I'll take the wheelbarrow and trade. Are we not at some point going to be doing that to the American economy? We can talk about spending, a couple of trillion here and a couple of trillion there. At some point, the currency is going to be useless. Now, while that might work out okay for some large businesses, I think for individuals and for smaller businesses, that currency crisis that we seem to be in the midst of creation could be extraordinary, could it not?
Yeah, sure. There's always potential. What I would say is, to all of this, is the guy that all these people that are doing all this monetary stimulus and fiscal stimulus between the Fed and and Congress, they're professing that the reason they're doing this is to help the little guy. Well, the guys that are hurting the most by doing all this is the little guy. And do I think we need some of this right now? Yes, I think
think we do, because we could be looking at much worse in terms of red lines and other things if they haven't stepped in. But there also will come, there's going to come a reckoning point if you keep doing this. It can't go on forever. But you know, the way the little guy and the big guy, whoever, there's a way to protect yourself, and that is to make investments if you can in things that inflate when the dollar value goes down, and those are things like stocks, bonds, gold, cryptocurrencies. You know, and by just doing things like investing money in your 401k fund, because you know it sort of it immunes you from some of this stuff going on, and it protects you a bit, because if they're going to suppress the value of the dollar more to try to stimulate growth, you know, the value of all those other things I just mentioned, real estate's another thing, they are going to rise. So if you're just sitting there solely in cash, you're getting hurt, because as the value of that cash becomes worth less and less, your value is going down. So the little guy that's just sitting there, just holding on to the money coming in the door from what he makes at his work, he's being hurt the most by all this stuff going on.
I have to say, and I want to go to John in just a second, but from the perspective of that little guy, the small business owner, the employee, who are desperately struggling just to have enough money for food to put on the table, I somehow suspect that suggesting that he go invest in real estate and gold would come off as a kind of elitist suggestion. I think the average American in many cases is investing in food at this point, that to put on the table the next week, rather than have the capability of thinking, well, I can do very well if I invest in buying precious metals or buying stock or buying real estate.
Well, I don't think the unemployment numbers are as bad as some of the stuff we see. You know, a lot of the stuff I've been looking at, reading, there is a lot of widespread fraud going on right now in unemployment benefits and jobless claims. That is inflating stuff. We also have a couple of Fed governors from some of the stuff I've been looking at, and they've been saying the last couple of days, they expect unemployment to be below 5% by the end of this year. So there are job gains being made. I think some of this it got very sensationalized going into the election cycle, and it's still being sensationalized a bit. You know, so we'll see. But yes, and I can understand. But if you are someone who is employed and you have a business owner that offers a 401k, you should be taking advantage of having, you know, even 1% of your paycheck just deducted to go into those things so you can protect yourself.
I've had a concern about the effects on the deficit as a result of these stimulus payments that have been made. There's no doubt, and I don't think there's any disagreement, that the American public did need a certain shot in the arm, let's call it, of finances to assist them, particularly in these extremely difficult times. But the last stimulus bill that was voted on by the Congress included millions upon millions of dollars for purposes that do not benefit the American public and have just increased the deficit. And this seems very likely that the next administration is going to give a larger stimulus and will probably attach a larger series of riders onto that bill, spending even more millions and millions that don't have anything to do with economic recovery. In the long run, what do you feel is the effect on the deficit as a result of all this spending?
Yeah. So with that stimulus bill, it got tied in with the government funding bill, right? So that was all part of it. And typically what that happens is what you're talking about, the spending to foreign powers, all these other things that comes as part of government funding. Is there potential for more stuff like that to be tied into the next bills we see coming? Sure, there is. Unfortunately, that is a reality with Congress. Whenever they do anything, these types of things happen. And are they always in our best interest? No, they're not. I think that brings it back to a more important conversation that you're highlighting. Is maybe we need to see people in Congress focus more on what's right for everyone and for the country, and sort of less for their best interests or their special interests. I think that would help you also have is a situation where Europe, they actually have to play catch up to the U.S. They approved a bunch of spending, and then it fell apart at the last minute because it was Hungary and Poland held up the process. Now, Hungary and Poland have recently come around on this. So Europe is going to be playing big time catch up with the U.S. That's probably going to devalue the euro. It's probably going to support the dollar a bit and maybe see the dollar rally some off of that. Again, depending on this next spending package. I mean, ultimately, if this keeps up, there is a point to which, you know, governments are backing themselves into a corner they can never get out of. You know, the only way you would be looking at potentially ending something that is you could have central banks all over the world just get together. There is an economist I used to work with. This interesting thought. He just didn't call it the big print. And basically what you would see was these guys would step in and they would just print whatever currency it took, their fiat currencies, and wipe out debt. You know, in the Bible, they talked about this as a jubilee where governments would come in and wipe out everybody's debt. But you know, that has the feel of where these things are headed. Where, you know, if you had the financial ministers and the heads of the five biggest nations in the world do stuff like this, again, I mean, that would ultimately be why you would want to make sure you are diversified in assets. Because if you saw them print currencies to wipe out their debt and reset the table to zero, it's going to drive the value of those things higher.
We've been speaking with Scott Garliss, who is the editor of Stansberry Newswire and the Stansberry Newswire Premium. Scott, thanks so much for being with us today.
I greatly appreciate it. Thank you Thank you for having me.
And to our audience, thanks for joining us today. We welcome our newest radio affiliate in Washington, D.C. at 96.7 FM. Watch us throughout the nation on Roku public broadcast stations and on the AMFM247.com network. Tell Alexa to play the program. Join us again next week. We are sponsored by the New York Analysis of Policy and Government, a division of the American Analysis of News and Media, Inc. at usagovpolicy.com and the Institute for American Politics. Email us at truthandradio@gmail.com. Our producer is the amazing Abigail White, and our director is the brilliant Jeff Hansen.